Before the smoke rose, before iron sang against iron, before the pulse of pistons began to echo across valleys and rivers, Europe moved to an older rhythm. It was a world governed by muscle, wind, and water. A world where daylight set the limits of ambition, and winter could silence entire regions into months of stillness. In the early 1700s, long before the term Industrial Revolution would enter the historian's vocabulary, change was already stirring beneath the soil of fields and beneath the cobblestones of market towns. The transformation began not in factories, but in fields. Across rural England, land that had once been scattered in communal strips was steadily reorganized through the Enclosure Acts. Fields were hedged, fenced, and claimed with new precision. Agricultural experimentation flourished under figures such as Jethro Tull, who introduced the seed drill, and landowners influenced by the methods of Charles Townshend, who promoted crop rotation with turnips and clover. These innovations may have seemed modest, even unremarkable, yet they altered the ancient compact between land and labor. Harvests grew more reliable. Livestock survived winter in greater numbers. Fewer hands were needed to coax food from the soil. And so, paradoxically, abundance displaced people. Families who had lived for generations on common land found themselves uprooted. Some drifted toward market towns, others sought wages in emerging centers of production. The countryside did not empty, but it loosened its hold. A quiet migration had begun, not yet the great surge into cities, but the first tremor of it. Meanwhile, Britain's global reach widened. Merchant ships stitched together continents in circuits of commerce, carrying textiles, sugar, tobacco, and enslaved human beings across oceans. Ports such as Bristol and Liverpool swelled with wealth drawn from colonial enterprise. Silver and goods flowed in, markets expanded outward. Demand grew not only for luxury, but for everyday cloth, durable, affordable, and plentiful. Textile production, long the province of cottages and spinning wheels, felt the strain first. For centuries, the putting-out system had prevailed. Merchants supplied raw wool or cotton to rural households, who spun and wove at their own pace. It was a decentralized world of labor, intimate and slow. But rising demand exposed its limits. Bottlenecks formed. Spinners could not keep pace with weavers. Production lagged behind appetite. Innovation, once a matter of curiosity, became necessity. In 1733, John Kay patented the flying shuttle, allowing a single weaver to produce cloth at unprecedented speed. What had required 2 pairs of hands could now be done with 1. Output soared, and with it, imbalance. The faster looms demanded more thread. The old spinning wheel, faithful companion of generations, could not match the tempo. It is tempting to see in these inventions a sudden leap, but history seldom leaps. It accumulates. Each improvement sharpened a contradiction. The more efficient production became, the more it demanded further efficiency. A system once content with gradual output was now pulled toward acceleration. Energy, too, began its transformation. Britain's forests had long supplied charcoal for heating and metalwork, yet timber was finite. Coal, black and abundant beneath the island's crust, offered a solution. Already mined for centuries, it now gained strategic importance. In regions like Northumberland and the Midlands, pits deepened. Yet coal brought its own problem. Water flooded the shafts, choking production. The need to drain mines would, in time, summon a machine unlike any the world had seen. For now, though, the early 18th century remained poised on a threshold. Markets expanded, agriculture modernized, labor shifted, and invention stirred restlessly in workshops and barns. The changes were uneven, often invisible to those living through them. A farmer adjusting to new crops could not foresee iron rails cutting across the countryside. A weaver, marveling at a quicker shuttle, could not imagine cities darkened by soot. And yet, the foundations were being laid. The old world had not yet ended, but it had begun to tremble. By the mid-18th century, Britain stood on the edge of mechanical awakening. The crisis in the coal mines, shafts drowning in groundwater, demanded more than ingenuity. It demanded power untethered from muscle, wind, or river. The first answer emerged in 1712, when Thomas Newcomen devised an atmospheric engine capable of pumping water from deep underground. It was clumsy, inefficient, and enormous. But it worked. Coal could be extracted in greater quantities, and with more coal came more heat, more metal, more possibility. Yet Newcomen's engine consumed vast amounts of fuel. It was a beginning, not a culmination. The decisive refinement came decades later through the restless mind of James Watt. In the 1760s, while repairing a model of a Newcomen engine at the University of Glasgow, Watt perceived its fatal inefficiency. It wasted heat by repeatedly cooling and reheating the cylinder. His solution, the separate condenser, transformed steam from a brute force into a disciplined servant. By partnering with the entrepreneur Matthew Boulton, Watt secured the capital and manufacturing precision needed to distribute improved engines across Britain. Steam was no longer confined to mines. It began to power mills. At the same time, the textile crisis intensified. The flying shuttle had accelerated weaving. Spinning had to catch up or collapse. In 1764, James Hargreaves introduced the spinning jenny, enabling a single worker to spin multiple spools of thread simultaneously. Soon after, Richard Arkwright patented the water frame, a machine driven by water power that produced stronger, more consistent yarn. Arkwright's genius was not merely mechanical, but organizational. He concentrated labor and machinery under one roof, creating early factories that ran on disciplined schedules rather than household rhythms. With Arkwright, the factory system found its architect. Then came Samuel Crompton, whose spinning mule combined the speed of the jenny with the strength of the water frame. Finer threads could now be produced at scale. Textile output soared. Rivers that once turned modest mill wheels now drove multi-story brick buildings filled with clattering frames. The sound was relentless, a metallic heartbeat replacing the soft whir of cottage wheels. But water, though powerful, was geographically stubborn. Mills had to stand beside fast-moving streams. Steam, by contrast, was mobile. When Watt's engines grew reliable enough to turn rotary motion, factories could rise wherever coal and labor converged. Urban centers like Manchester and Birmingham expanded with startling speed. What had been towns became industrial cities. What had been fields became streets lined with chimneys. Iron kept pace with steam. The production of stronger, cheaper iron became critical for machinery, rails, and tools. In earlier generations, charcoal had limited furnace size and output. The innovation of coke smelting, pioneered by Abraham Darby I at Coalbrookdale in the early 1700s, allowed iron to be produced using coal-derived fuel. This seemingly technical adjustment unleashed structural transformation. Iron grew abundant. Engines, bridges, and machines could be built with greater durability and scale. The very landscape began to change. Canals sliced across countryside to transport heavy goods efficiently. Investment flooded into infrastructure, binding regions into a tighter economic web. Time itself felt compressed. Goods moved faster. Markets responded more quickly. Expectations rose. And yet, beneath the triumph of invention, unease simmered. Artisans who had once controlled their pace and craft found themselves displaced by machines that demanded obedience rather than skill. The factory bell replaced the village clock. Labor became measured, supervised, and standardized. Women and children entered mills in staggering numbers, drawn by wages, but subjected to long hours and hazardous conditions. Progress and suffering advanced together. By the closing decades of the 18th century, the elements of industrial society were no longer scattered experiments. They formed a system, interlocking, self-reinforcing, accelerating. Coal fed steam. Steam powered machinery. Machinery multiplied production. Production expanded markets. Markets demanded more coal. The rumble was now unmistakable. Britain had crossed from improvement into revolution, not in the language of barricades, but in the language of engines. By the final decades of the 18th century, the revolution no longer whispered in workshops. It thundered in cities. Manchester, once a modest market town, grew into a forest of brick and chimney. Birmingham, already a centre of metal trades, swelled with workshops and foundries. Leeds, Sheffield, and countless smaller towns followed. What distinguished these places was not merely size, but density, of labour, of machinery, of ambition. Smoke hung in the air like a permanent twilight. The scent of coal seeped into clothing, into lungs, into memory. Urbanization advanced at a pace for which no precedent existed. Rural families arrived seeking wages, security, and opportunity. They found instead narrow streets, hastily built housing, and rooms packed with bodies. Sanitation lagged far behind expansion. Water sources grew contaminated. Disease traveled swiftly through overcrowded quarters. Yet the flow of migrants didn't cease. However harsh the city, it promised cash income in a world increasingly governed by money. Inside the factories, a new social order took shape. Work was no longer defined by season or sunlight, but by the relentless rotation of gears. Shifts stretched 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours. Bells summoned workers before dawn. Whistles dismissed them after dark. The body became synchronized to the machine. Fatigue was constant. Accidents were frequent. Limbs could be caught in spinning frames. Lungs could fill with fiber and dust. Children, valued for their small size and nimble fingers, crawled beneath machines to retrieve fallen thread. Women tended looms and spindles, while also bearing the burdens of domestic labor. Men oversaw heavier machinery or labored in mines that fed the furnaces above ground. The division of labor sharpened distinctions, even as it bound workers into shared dependence on wages. Resistance emerged almost as quickly as discipline. Artisans who had lost their livelihoods to mechanized production sometimes turned to destruction. In the 1810s, on the threshold of a new century, but rooted in the upheavals of the late 1700s, groups known as the Luddites smashed frames and looms they believed threatened their survival. Though their name became synonymous with hostility to technology, their grievance was less against innovation itself than against a system that stripped them of bargaining power and dignity. Government response was swift and severe. Machine breaking became a capital offense. Troops guarded factories. Order was enforced not only by law but by necessity. The industrial economy could not pause without risking collapse. Meanwhile, new ideas about labor and society began to circulate. Philosophers and reformers observed the widening gulf between wealth and poverty. The same engines that generated immense fortunes for mill owners produced grinding hardship for workers. Wealth accumulated in counting houses, even as entire families lived in single damp rooms. The industrial city was a study in contrasts, grand civic buildings rising beside slums, gaslit streets, bordering alleys, sunk in darkness. It produced both philanthropy and indifference. Some factory owners experimented with improved housing and education for workers, recognizing that stability served profit. Others pursued expansion with ruthless singularity. Beyond Britain, the revolution stirred curiosity and competition. Continental Europe watched carefully. Entrepreneurs traveled to inspect mills, sometimes smuggling designs and knowledge back home. The technology could not be contained within one island. It was too profitable, too transformative. Transport itself began to accelerate change. Improved roads and expanding canal networks linked regions more tightly. Goods once costly to move could now travel cheaply and reliably. Coal fed not only local industry, but distant markets. The economy grew increasingly integrated, less a collection of isolated towns, more a national organism driven by shared arteries of trade. And through it all, time seemed to quicken. Generations that had once expected continuity now experienced upheaval within a single lifetime. A child born in a rural village might, by adulthood, inhabit a city powered by steam. Grandparents struggled to comprehend the speed at which familiar patterns dissolved. The revolution was no longer a set of inventions. It was an atmosphere, pervasive, inescapable, reshaping not only how people worked, but how they understood progress itself. The smoke did not merely darken the sky, it obscured the horizon of what society had once been. By the dawn of the 19th century, the transformation that had begun in hedged fields and flooded coal pits had matured into something unmistakable, a new civilization in motion. The Industrial Revolution was no longer confined to textile mills or steam engines. It had altered the architecture of power itself. Wealth shifted from landed aristocracies to industrial capitalists. Influence followed investment. Parliaments and policies increasingly reflected the priorities of commerce, infrastructure, and expansion. The rhythms of agrarian life, once dominant for millennia, now competed with the tempo of markets and machines. Steam extended its dominion beyond stationary factories. Engineers refined high-pressure engines, and inventors imagined movement unbound by horse or sail. Though the full railway age would crest in the 19th century, its foundations were laid in these years of mechanical daring. Iron rails, stronger and more precise, began to appear in mining districts. The logic was irresistible. If steam could pump water and spin frames, it could pull weight across land. The implications were profound. Distance shrank. Regions once separated by days of travel edged closer in hours. Perishable goods reached urban markets before spoiling. News circulated with increasing speed. The nation felt less fragmented, more integrated, a network rather than a patchwork. Yet progress demanded a reckoning. Industrial wealth did not distribute itself evenly. Factory owners amassed fortunes unimaginable to previous generations. Banking houses flourished. Urban elites commissioned grand homes and civic institutions. Meanwhile, laborers endured wages that barely sustained survival. Economic cycles, booms fueled by speculation and busts triggered by overproduction, exposed workers to sudden unemployment. Security, once tied to land and community, became vulnerable to distant market forces. New social philosophies emerged in response. Thinkers questioned whether unregulated industry served the common good. Reform movements pressed for shorter working hours, safer conditions, and protections for children. The very concept of rights expanded from political liberty toward economic justice. The industrial age forced society to confront an unsettling truth. Technological triumph did not guarantee human flourishing. Beyond Britain's shores, the revolution radiated outward. France, Belgium, and parts of Germany began adopting mechanized production. The United States, rich in land and resources, embraced industrial methods with particular vigor. Factories rose along rivers in New England. Canals stitched together interior frontiers. What had begun as a British phenomenon evolved into a transatlantic transformation. Empire, too, adapted to industry's demands. Colonies were drawn more tightly into networks of raw material extraction and manufactured imports. Cotton from plantations fed European mills. Finished textiles returned to distant markets. The revolution intensified global interdependence and inequality. Regions that industrialized rapidly gained strategic advantage. Those that did not risked subordination within a world increasingly defined by mechanized productivity. Culturally, the age reshaped imagination. Writers and artists grappled with landscapes blackened by soot and rivers clouded by waste. Some celebrated human ingenuity, others mourned the erosion of pastoral simplicity. The debate was not merely aesthetic, but existential. What did it mean for humanity to command such power over nature? Could society master the forces it had unleashed? By the close of the 1700s, the old order of Europe had not vanished, but it had been irrevocably altered. The Industrial Revolution didn't topple thrones in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it eroded and reconfigured the foundations upon which power rested. It created new classes, new conflicts, new expectations. Most of all, it transformed time. Where earlier centuries had moved with deliberate steadiness, the industrial age accelerated history itself. Invention begot invention. Improvement became habitual. The future ceased to resemble the past. Generations now anticipated that their children's world would differ dramatically from their own. And so the story of the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s closes not with silence, but with momentum. Smoke still curls from chimneys. Engines still turn. The revolution doesn't end. It evolves. From coal-darkened valleys rose a force that would reshape continents, reorder societies, and redefine the boundaries of possibility. Humanity had harnessed steam, and in doing so had set history on a new and relentless course.